All right. So we're going to start today by talking about evolution, natural selection. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the history of scientists' thoughts on evolution. And then we'll talk a little bit about how evolution works, how it happens. So when we talk about evolution, you guys were pretty good when I asked you in your question of the day. Our definition we're going to use of evolution, it's a change in a population over time. And usually it's gradual, but not always. We sometimes have more rapid examples of evolution, examples in which scientists can record data and see it happening. But oftentimes, the evolution of a population takes a long time. So there are some different ideas, or there were some different ideas about how species evolved. And one of these older ideas that was sort of discredited over time was this idea proposed by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. His idea was that organisms could pass on traits that they acquired during their lifetime. So, think about an example. Let's say if I work out all the time, become really strong, develop very large muscles. When I have children, are they going to come out and be like little muscular babies?
Yes, this is so funny.
No.
It's so funny.
Right, so no, they wouldn't. How about if you suntan a lot and you make your skin darker through suntanning? Does that mean when you have children, they're going to have darker skin? No. So Lamarck, however, thought that these changes that happen in an organism's body during its lifetime could be passed on to the next generation. And that's how he thought species change over time. Okay? So, for example, if we think about giraffes, and we think about what would Lamarck think about giraffes and their necks. Obviously, we know giraffes have long necks. And so a question might be, how did they evolve to have such long necks? Because fossil evidence shows that giraffes didn't always have such long necks. They evolved from animals that had much shorter necks. So how did they get so long? Well, Lamarck's idea would be, well, the giraffe's food's up in the trees, and so giraffes have to stretch up to get as much food as possible. They stretch their neck up. And then, when they reproduce, they pass on that slightly longer neck to their offspring. And then those offspring stretch their neck a little bit more because they're reaching into the trees. And that gets passed on. You think that's really how it works? No. It's a false theory. It's an idea that kind of made sense in some ways. But we know today that these traits, these acquired traits during an organism's lifetime, cannot be passed on to the next generation. What do organisms pass on to their offspring? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Where is that information though? How does that get from parents to their children? Okay.
DNA?
Yeah. So the only thing that parents pass on to their offspring is some of their DNA. In organisms that reproduce sexually, the male provides half of the genetic information, and the female provides the other half of the genetic information. And that's all that gets actually passed on to the offspring. The only things that get passed on are the DNA. any change to our DNA in reproductive cells could get passed on, but changes during our lifetime don't get passed on. One interesting experiment, it's kind of cruel, but a scientist called Weissman did an experiment in which he took a bunch of mice and measured the lengths of their tails, and then he cut the tails off and bred the mice together and did this many, many generations. So according to Lamarck, what would he expect to see? Yeah, that in each generation, the tails of the mice might get shorter. But that's not what he saw. He saw that the tail length didn't change at all. Even after many generations of him chopping the tails off of mice, they didn't get shorter. So that's not a correct theory. All right, so a little while later, Charles Darwin, famous scientist. Charles Darwin, talked a little bit about his background. He was a naturalist. He really loved being outdoors. He loves collecting plants and animals and studying things like fossils, sort of like an outdoorsman. But he never really could settle on what he wanted to do for his career. He was maybe going to be a pastor, maybe going to be a doctor, and sort of nothing really clicked with him until he was asked to go on a voyage. Okay? He lived in the 1800s, the middle of the 1800s. And he was asked to go on a ship called the HMS Beagle. The Beagle was going to take about 5 years to sail all the way around the entire Earth. And along the way, stop in various places, trade. His job on that ship was to be the ship's naturalist. Basically, he would study the different environments that they came to, collect things like fossils and animals and plant specimens, document them, describe them, and sort of take in all that information. And so this is where he started off in England. He was English, Charles Darwin. They traveled down around the coast of South America, making stops along the way, up the western coast of South America, went by the Galapagos Islands, which are really important to Darwin's research, okay, down through Australia, around Australia to Africa, okay, around the Cape of Good Hope, back to South America, until eventually returning back to England 5 years later. So this is a long trip. So along the way, Charles Darwin started thinking about all of these living things that he was seeing. This huge diversity. Imagine if you took that trip, how many different types of animals and plants and mushrooms and all sorts of things you would see. All these different ecosystems. And he noticed sometimes that things like the animals that lived in very dry conditions, whether those dry conditions were in South America or Africa or Australia, they had some things in common. He also noticed that in certain areas, the organisms living there looked similar to each other, but with slight variations. And they started thinking about, well, why would this be the case? Why are these organisms all so different, but also have similarities in certain ways? And so he started thinking about his idea called natural selection. Natural selection is the how species evolve over time, sort of the how it happens. Evolution tells us they change. Natural selection tells us how that actually takes place. Here's Darwin as he was an older man. He actually took a long time after he got back to England, looking through his collections, writing his research, writing a publication that he could share with people. And he was a little apprehensive, a little scared about publishing it because it conflicted with lots of the ideas that people held at that time. So around that time, you might not have all these slides, okay? Around the time and before Darwin's time, there were some ideas that many people had. And one of those was that, first of all, the Earth was only 6,000 years old. Okay? Most people believe that. The Earth is only 6,000 years old. So that may seem like a long time, but in terms of the Earth's history, it's really not that long, 6,000 years. And most people believe that, well, the species we have that we see around us today have always been here on Earth. And they never would change. okay? That they were stable. Okay? And so most people held those ideas, but around Darwin's time, there were a lot of different sciences sort of questioning some of these things. Geologists, this is a time when geologists were thinking about the Earth and the age of the Earth, studying the different processes that create mountains and continents and so forth. And what they started to determine is that the Earth is much, much older than the 6,000 years that many people believe. Okay? The Earth is about 4.5, 4.6 billion years old. So that's much longer than 6,000. Humans, as we know them, have been around for a couple 100,000 years. Okay? Life has been on Earth for about 3.5 billion years. Geologists started understanding how the plates on the Earth's surface moved around, okay? And how they did that very slowly and gradually over time. How landforms change, how mountains form. And so Darwin was, being a naturalist, was aware of all of this research. He knew about these new ideas. And so he started thinking, well, if the Earth has been around so long, there was a lot of time for small changes in organisms to sort of build up. And that could be responsible for these changes that we see. You know, things like finding fossils of organisms that are no longer here, extinct fossils, dinosaur fossils. We know they don't exist on Earth today, but they did at some point in the past. Finding fossils of sea creatures way at the top of a mountain. Okay. Those are things that led Darwin to question some of the things that people had believed before that. So his conclusions after studying and thinking about this was that, first of all, species change over time. They are not fixed. What we see today was not always here, and what's here today may not always be here in the future. These species can change over time. Kayla?
So people say like, dogs, like wolves are dogs' ancestors.
Yeah.
Does that is that kind of like similar to?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that in a minute, but that's a great question. Yes. So dogs' ancestors are wolves, and we know about how that happened. How did wolves split off and one group evolved into what we would call dogs? What?
I saw this evolution chain of horse. It used to have these little things. They had toes. They're like the size of a dog.
Yeah. Yeah, the fossil horses were not what we know today. And why it's exactly right. Horses were like dog-sized creatures. They had toes rather than hooves. And scientists have found the fossils that show not just that that's what horses were once like, but also fossils showing the steps in between, which brought horses to what we call today modern horses. Yeah, I'll show you a slide of that. So the evolution is the scientific theory that species change over time. Go ahead and write that down. And evolution can explain why we have such a huge diversity of living things on Earth. Why are things similar in some ways? Why are they different in other ways? How are species related to each other? Evolution helps us to answer those sorts of questions. So before we talk about natural selection, which is the idea that Darwin proposed about how species change, we're going to talk first about something that's a little different, artificial selection. And this will get to what Caitlin was talking about regarding dogs and wolves. So artificial selection, okay, is when humans intervene and interfere with the normal sort of reproduction of plants or animals to try to get certain desirable traits from these species. So what this slide shows, this picture on the right, it shows the ancestral plants that gave rise to modern foods. So this is the type of fruit that eventually we would know today as a watermelon. This is what corn evolved from. This is what bananas evolved from. And eggplants, and carrots, and cabbage, and broccoli. Things that don't look anything like what we know them as today. And so, how did this happen? It didn't happen sort of naturally. It didn't just happen randomly. Humans changed all of these things into the foods that we know today. How do you think they did that? How could humans take this thing, kind of looks like some kind of grass, and that's changed now into corn? Do you have any ideas?
Because usually when you grow stuff, you like crunch it all together.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that could have contributed to it.
Okay. Caitlin?
If they planted different seeds like very closely and then when they sprouted, they kind of like merged together.
Okay. Getting there, Wyatt?
Fertilizing and all that they just plant them in.
So planting them in different things?
Yeah, or like the area they planted.
Okay.
Like for the watermelon, there's usually a bunch of seeds, and then when we know today, they could have put like thousands of other seeds in there, and it could have made it bigger.
Okay. Yeah, so you guys are on the right track. So let's take the watermelon example. Okay. So does this look very appetizing?
No.
No. But maybe at some point in the distant past, humans realized that this flesh of this fruit was edible. Okay? So if you find some of these wild watermelon ancestors growing, okay, you could eat them. Now, if you take those wild watermelon plants, are they all identical to each other? Or is there some variation? Yeah. So if you wanted to start growing some of these, which of them would you pick to grow in your field? Which one? Well, maybe they're not red right away, but maybe like you find one example that has like more of the fleshy part that you can eat and taste a little bit better. Maybe you take seeds from that one and then you grow those. And when you grow those, what do you think the offspring are going to be like? Some of them be a little bit better. And maybe just a tiny bit sweeter with a little bit more of the edible part. And which one are you going to grow from that? The best one. And if you repeat that thousands and thousands of times, you can gradually sort of shape what that plant's going to be like. All right, let's think about dogs. Did dogs just naturally evolve from wolves? No. They evolved through this process of artificial selection. Can anyone think of like how this might have happened? Danielle?
Maybe like somebody took like a wolf and like gave it water and food, so it kind of evolved over time.
Okay. Jake?
I would say like people probably got the least aggressive wolf and then like maybe it didn't like have teeth or something.
Okay.
Sharp teeth.
Okay. Sophia?
If they took a wolf and they started teaching it how to act like a dog, or like taming it almost, then when they start having offspring, the dogs will start.
Okay. Max?
I think kind of what Jake said, but like they take the least aggressive wolves and then breed them, and then the least aggressive wolves among the next generation, and then keep breeding them until they have like
So yeah, you guys are right. It's basically, you have, some wolves, and maybe some of them came near humans or would, sort of come to find scraps of food and whatnot. And maybe at some point humans found a wolf that was not that aggressive, right? And maybe they took it and allowed it to live near their village. And then when it had offspring out of those, well, probably some of its like temperament would be passed on to the baby wolves, the wolf pups. And they would choose from those the least. What would they do if there's an aggressive pup in there? Probably send it out or kill it. And which ones would they allow to be around more and feed more? The least aggressive ones. And continue that, 50, 100, 1,000 generations, and you end up with a group. So it's not all wolves didn't evolve into dogs, right? Just this sort of subset that humans started to work with. And by selecting the least aggressive, or maybe the most helpful, things like that, then they were allowed to survive and eventually became dogs. And even further, all the breeds we have today, where did they come from? Yeah, they have been bred through the same method, through artificial selection. How could we have some dogs like a Chihuahua that's this big, and then a Great Dane that's this big? Yeah?
Because of their DNA.
Yeah, but how did they come about?
Take the small fruit, put it all, and
Yeah, you take the smallest of this litter, the smallest of this litter, breed them together. Probably they're going to have small offspring. Take the smallest of those, breed them together, and eventually get tiny little dogs, or the biggest, or the ones that swim the best, or the ones that can hunt the best. And so you can choose which ones, if we can choose which ones breed together, humans can influence the pathway that they're going to change at. And this is artificial selection. It's done for all domestic animals, cats, okay, dogs, cows, all livestock, all agricultural crops have been formed through artificial selection. So now, could humans breed dogs that have gills and could swim underwater?
Yes.
Yes? How would that happen?
No.
How would that happen?
Because a dog is a mammal and a fish is not a mammal.
True.
It seems kind of weird.
It might be weird, but humans cannot create brand new characteristics. They can't breed a hamster that has wings. The variation, the differences has to be there within their DNA somehow, and then humans can sort of enhance it. Okay? But they can't add a new feature to a species or something. They can sort of shape the features that already are there in their DNA. So, what is this? It's a hairless cat. Okay? How would you breed a hairless cat? Through artificial selection. Anyone think about? They're just born without that fur. It's not that their fur has been cut off. Balthazar?
Maybe you have like the cat with the least amount of hair.
Yeah. So it doesn't happen in one generation. You can't just breed two cats and all of a sudden they have no hair. You might do the ones with the shortest hair or the least dense hair. Breed them together. Get their kittens. As they grow up, see which ones have the least, and just repeat that process many times.
If like if the cat had like the disease thing where they like been born and didn't have a lot of hair, then they're like children and all that. Would it happen?
Yeah, now you're getting ahead of us. That's a great idea. That maybe there was something that happened to one specific cat that led to it being born without hair. Well, if you took that cat, maybe that trait would be passed on to its offspring.
Because of like the medical history.
Sort of. We have a word we're going to use for that. I don't know, you guys probably don't know what it is. A sudden change in an organism that leads to a change in its DNA. It's called a mutation.
Oh, I knew that.
So here's an example. This is the ancestor of modern dogs, the gray wolf. And in different areas, different breeds were developed through artificial selection. And so that's where we get hundreds and hundreds of dog breeds that we have today. Here's corn. Okay? Again, corn was selected for the plants that had the most sugar in them, that had the most starch, that had the sort of juiciest or fullest kernels. And over time, we have modern corn, which evolved from this ancestral corn. All right. So, question is, well, how do we know that species change over time? We said most people thought species were fixed. They would never change over time. Okay? But we know now that they do. So how do we know this? One of the best types of evidence are these things. What are they? Fossils. We have fossil evidence. Fossils are the traces of organisms that have been preserved from often long ago. Millions of years often. Billions of years. And so by looking at the fossils of what organisms were like millions or billions of years ago, we could understand how they've changed. And why I was talking about horses. That's a great example. Horse fossils. We know what horses were like 1 million years ago, 2 million, 7, 8, 10 million years ago, and we could see the sort of process by which they changed. Where do you find fossils? Sage? In the ground. In what? Anyone more specific? Kevin?
In certain layers are the oldest, like the top layers where the newest ones are, and the bottom is where the older ones are.
Yeah. You know what kind of rock? You guys learned about rocks maybe before? What kind of rock do you find fossils
I know
in?
there's sedimentary.
Sedimentary rock that's deposited in layers and then solidifies. And as Devin was saying, the deeper down the fossil is, typically, the older it is. So by looking in different layers of the earth, we can see how old these fossils are. We also know species evolve by looking at modern organisms and carefully analyzing their body structures. This shows the limb of a human, cat, a whale, and a bat. Now you might look at the exterior of those organs and say, well, they're not very similar to each other, right? A human arm versus a cat's leg versus the flipper of a whale versus a bat's wing, they're all completely different. One flies, one swims, one walks. Okay? But when you look a little further, if you look at the bone structure inside of those limbs, there's actually a lot of similarities. All of those organs have one upper arm bone. Okay? The humerus. Just like we have that upper arm bone. All of these organisms have two bones in their forearm area. Okay? Here, 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 here. Okay, the ulna and radius bone. They have wrist bones in yellow here. And they have the phalanges, finger bones. They're all there in all of these organisms. Now, in some, they're bigger or smaller or thicker or thinner. But they're all the same exact bones underneath that bat's wing or underneath that whale's flipper, etc. And that tells, what do you think that tells us about these four things? Why would they have these similar bones? They're all very different, aren't they?
Maybe they originated from some sort of
Yeah, that they have a common ancestor. That somewhere in the distant past, humans, cats, whales, bats had a common ancestor. And the reason they have these similar bone structures is because they evolved from an ancestor that had that bone structure. Okay? We can look at other species, even these, a mammal, a bird, an alligator, a turtle. Those are really different from each other. Right? We have mammals, birds, we have reptiles. Okay? We have fish down here. Well, they all evolved from a fish that had these lobe fins that had a similar type of bone structure that led to these all having a similar bone structure. This is all these things. I don't know, maybe you like them, maybe you don't. Cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, kale, kohlrabi. They all evolved from one type of plant, wild mustard plant. How else do we know? Where species are located can tell us a little bit about their evolution. Species that live in a close area often are more similar to each other because they probably evolved from the same ancestors. Whereas organisms that live on distant, isolated islands usually have unique features, unique adaptations, because they sort of evolved separately. Look at this picture of Mr. Arcuri standing next to a baby.
Oh, I thought you meant he was the baby.
Oh no, I didn't mean he was a baby. So, DNA evidence as well is important. We can nowadays analyze the DNA that's in. We talked about characteristic living things. They all have the same genetic code. So we can compare the DNA of different organisms. And that can tell us if they're related or not. Humans and chimps, we share 96% of our genetic code with chimps. Good. What does that tell us? It tells us
Now we used to be chimps.
no. That's what people always say. That humans evolved from chimps. What is the proper way to say it? Jake?
Two chimps had a baby.
And a human came out? No, Jake. I'm sorry. The other Jake? Yes, that they have a common ancestor. That if you go back in time, you could find an ancestor that eventually gave rise to, sort of like this. Who are you most closely related to in the world?
Your parents.
No,
Brothers.
your sibling. You and your sibling share the most common DNA. Who's your common ancestor? Your parents. Who's your next closest relative?
Grandparents.
No,
Aunts and uncles.
your cousin.
What?
Who's the common ancestor of you and your cousin?
Aunts and uncles.
No.
Grandparents.
Your grandparents, right? You and all of your first cousins have the same grandparents. You and your sibling have the same parents. What about your second cousin?
Aunts and uncles.
No, because you're not a common ancestor.
Uncle. I mean, cousins.
Great grandparents. Imagine going back further and further. The more distantly related two things are, the farther back you have to go to find their common ancestor. Yes, Danielle.
Cousins. So their grandmother is my great grandmother, but we're still second cousins.
Yeah, but it's like that once removed.
Or no, I mean great aunt.
Yeah.
Wait, does that mean that me and Jupiter could be like 16 cousins?
So if you follow this pattern back, everyone on Earth
Is related.
is related.
Oh my god, hey brother.
I was one of that.
So we're all part of the same big family.
I've been saying that since like
Oh my god.
All right, we're going to stop here, and I'm not going to give you your homework because we didn't get that far.
So whoever.
No homework.